This is going to be an update video for the React for Beginners tutorial series that was released by Wes Bos back in November of 2015. And since its release, there have been some changes to libraries and other dependencies used in the tutorial that have made it a little bit harder to follow some of the things done in some of the videos. What we're going to focus on today is the last video in the tutorial series, which is dealing with OAuth authentication using Firebase. And Firebase is what is effectively being used as our backend service to sign in and authenticate users for the inventory of this application. And since its release, when this series was originally released, Firebase was on version 2, and Google has since made Firebase version 3, which is not backwards compatible with version 2. So some of the ways that you call methods to sign in users or sign them out or save them has changed a little bit in those versions. And people who have come to the last video in this series have noticed some of those changes. And when they head over to firebase.com, you can kind of see that this has become a legacy console. And they're advising people to make the upgrade to their newest version of Firebase, Firebase 3. So this video is going to be on how we can go ahead and use Firebase 3 to complete the React for Beginners tutorial. In order to get the current application ready to use Firebase 3, we're going to need to first update our version of Firebase in our package.json. So you can see we're currently using version 2.3.1. Let's go ahead and remove that and install Firebase, save it again. Again, this will install the latest version of this package directly from npm, which should be version 3. something. We can see it's version 3.2.1. So now our app is ready to use Firebase version 3. We also want to make sure that in our scripts components app.js, you can see that when this was uploaded to GitHub, it's including Wes's Firebase app, which is catch of the day. And we want to be able to use our own Firebase app here, which we can do through the Firebase console. You can either create a new project or import a old version 2 Firebase app over to version 3. So I actually finished this tutorial when version 2 was still the main one, but this one here I was able to port over and there were no problems. For the tutorial I'm doing now, I've gone ahead and created a new project called React is Awesome. So if we want to go ahead and copy that there and paste it in for our Firebase app, you remember that Rebase is what we're using to connect React with our Firebase backend. The other thing to note is that Wes's original video, video 29, the first 8 minutes or so of this video is actually all just React code. So if you remember, we created the render login method, an h2 tag, and a few button tags relating to how we're going to log in our users. We also created a constructor function that was dealing with setting up our initial state, which was really just a UID property set to an empty string. And we also created a few other states that the render method may put out for the inventory component, depending on whether or not a user is logged in or if a user is the owner of a store. So it's not up until about 8 minutes in that we actually start using Firebase. And this is usually where people start running into trouble on this video, because this will inevitably throw an error, specifically this new Firebase. So just to get caught up to speed in that case, with those first 8 minutes, I'm just going to go ahead and add some of the code that was introduced in those first 8 minutes. So that includes the render login method, right, where we're just creating those buttons. I'm just doing GitHub and Twitter here just for the sake of brevity. I'm not including Facebook. We also want to create the constructor function that sets up our initial state. The other part we want is some of that logic for the different states of the render component. And I believe Wes also includes the logout button in the inventory, the original return. So if we go back to our application now, we should see that we have those buttons there. Of course, they don't do anything, but now we're at a decent starting point where moving ahead, kind of at this point where we're importing Firebase and creating a new instance of it, is going to cause some problems. So if we go back to our Firebase console, and you can see directly in the front banner here, we can find out how to add Firebase to our web app. If we open this up, let it load here, it says copy and paste a snippet below at the bottom of your HTML or before other script tags. So they are telling us how to initialize our Firebase app in an HTML script tag, but we just want to do it inside of our JavaScript file. So we can go ahead and pull out the JavaScript that they're including, and we'll go ahead and paste that in here. Now notice the difference between these few things. One, they've given us an API key for this Firebase instance, an auth domain, the database URL, which is the same as what we originally passed in Firebase 2, and a storage bucket. Now the only one that really matters here, and the only one that we need to worry about is this database URL, but the rest is part of the config for Firebase 3. So we can get rid of that reference variable now. Maybe we make our config a const, and we can probably just replace the lowercase use. Seems a little bit more appropriate. It seems like they use lowercase Firebase in a lot of places. So now that we have that, if we go back to our console, or excuse me, our application, we can see that we've loaded up and there are no console errors anymore. What we'd like to do now is make it so that pressing these buttons actually authenticates the user and pulls up a pop-up screen that will allow the user to authorize the application and return that user's data. And in order to do that, we're going to add an onClick event handler for the button, passing it the method we'd like to be invoked when the user clicks the button, which we'll call this.authenticate, which is a method we've yet to write yet. And if we'd like to pass this method any arguments, such as the provider name or anything else, we can't just call it directly here as an argument, because writing the function like this with the parentheses will actually invoke it or run it directly on the page load and return the event handler itself. Instead, we'd like to use bind, which is a way in JavaScript to be explicit about setting the context which you'd like a function to run, as well as any arguments that you'd like to pass in. And this, in this case, is any instance of our inventory component. And bind will allow you to set these things without actually invoking the function directly. So if we go ahead and write our authenticate method with the provider as its only argument, we can go ahead and just console.log trying to auth with, and passing in the provider. Now, clicking this button will just show we're trying to auth with GitHub, and that is basically just showing that our event handler is working for clicking the button. In order to actually get the pop-up menu to appear, let's head over to our Firebase console and go to Getting Started with Firebase for Web Apps. And you can see that they've included great documentation for different guides and references and samples and a ton of stuff, all with their own sidebar here for how you would handle, again, guides for storage, guides for remote configuration, and in our case, authentication, that we'd like to be able to use on the web for GitHub right now. And it's telling us that we'd like to, or it's giving us the steps to make this happen. And the first one is just to add Firebase to our web app. We've done that. Register your app as a developer application on GitHub. And this is covered in Wes's video as well, but just for a refresher, these are our developer applications under OAuth applications on GitHub, which provide you a client secret and client ID that shouldn't be shared with anyone. And then under apps.twitter.com, you can do the same thing for creating new applications. And back in our Firebase console, under auth sign-in method, you can enable and disable certain sign-in providers. So I've gone ahead and already enabled GitHub and Twitter, again, just passing in those client IDs and client secrets provided by the application. For the callback URL, Wes had mentioned it was a little bit difficult for him to remember or him to figure out where exactly we'd like to have that, because in a lot of cases for applications, it is for your machine itself. So passing in localhost would be the callback. But in Firebase, this case, we'd actually like to pass our Firebase app as the callback URL. And it's nice that they are explicit about this when setting up a new sign-in provider. Notice here that the provider is no longer just a string like GitHub or Twitter. It is now a new object, a GitHub auth provider or a Twitter auth provider or a Facebook auth provider that we will need to pass in as our provider instance to the authenticate method. And scrolling down a little bit further, we can see that we're now expecting to be able to call firebase.auth.signin with popup, passing it that provider. So if we go ahead and copy that code over, we can go ahead and paste that in here. And again, that provider member is not a string anymore, so we're going to want to change what we're passing to authenticate to be that new Firebase auth GitHub auth provider. Now this method's getting a little bit long here. I'm going to go ahead and drop it onto a few lines, or sorry, this button element. Okay, so we have firebase.auth.signin with popup, passing it the provider. And rather than passing this a callback function to handle our errors and our auth data, as was done in Firebase 2, we're actually going to be, or what this returns, what sign-in with popup now returns, is actually a promise. And you can see this by the use of the .then function and .catch function, and sometimes finally will be in some of these. And promises are kind of the same as callbacks, except for they allow for a lot more chainability and composability. So if we go ahead and call .then on our promise, we can see that it will give us back a result object. And if we just go ahead and console log out result, we can see what we get back from our application. So let's log in with GitHub. It's logging in, and we get back this user, or this object with a user and credential key. And it's a little bit confusing or opaque what exactly the proper, or what the values are of those keys. But if we open it up, we can see that our user object actually gives us back our user email, our UID, and the credential object gives back the access token and the provider. And this object is a little bit different than the return type that some may be familiar with from Wes's original video, which, if you see his object that is being returned from his authenticate method, the provider, user ID, and token are actually all at the top level of the return object. And in our case, everything is either nested in the credential key or the user key. Now, inside of our .then callback, rather than writing everything inline inside of here, we're going to go ahead and pass this off to another method called this.auth handler. Again, something we haven't written yet, but we can go ahead and do that now. And auth handler will be passed that that result data that we just console logged out previously. The first thing we'd like to be able to do is check errors, but that actually won't be handled in our auth handler anymore. That will be handled inside of our promise chain. And if we look back at our Firebase guide reference here, we can see that there is a .catch method which takes a callback itself for returning errors if there is a problem logging the user in. So we can go ahead and call .catch, giving it the error as its only argument, and just console.airing out the error. Working with that result data that's now passed into our auth handler method, a better name for that may be auth data for that argument. And the first thing that we want to be able to do in here is grab the current store that we're viewing. And by store, I mean the part of the URL that comes after store when we're currently viewing a place that has an inventory. If we look at our React DevTools right now, the only place that really has access to that store is the apps component props.params.storeID. And we need to be able to access it in the inventory component, which is where we're currently using it. And it currently does not exist there. If we want to go ahead and get access to it, we need to head over to the app component where we're actually calling the inventory component. And you can see that we're passing a lot of other props down for other methods we've created. And in order to just pass all props from a parent to a child, we can use a spread operator, which is just 3 dots and then this.props. And doing this will pass all props from the parent down to the child component. And if we now look at our inventory component, we can see that we have the params.storeID. And if we go back to our inventory component in our code, we can go ahead and set that equal to a variable so that we can get access to that store. So we'll call that store ref is equal to firebase.database.reference to the store plus this.props.params.storeID. And this will give us back the reference to that current store that we're using. With that reference in hand, we'll now be able to look at the current store and see if we have an owner for that store, as well as be able to update the internal state of this inventory component to set the user and the current owner of any given store. First thing we want to be able to do is call storeref.onValue, which is just kind of a listener that will be able to provide us a callback for when the store ref is actually loaded, and that will give us a snapshot which we can use to grab the current store ref data. So we can say var data equals equals snapshot dot val, or if we're the very first person to ever visit the store, we just want to be able to return an empty object. And after that, we want to be able to check if that return data has an owner. Then we can go ahead and just claim the store as our own. And we can do that by doing storeref.set owner as our auth data user.uid. And remember that auth data was that object that was being passed to us that included the user and the credentials. The next thing we want to be able to do is update our state to reflect the current store owner and logged in user. And to do this, we can just do this.set state, where the UID of our state will be our auth data.user.uid, and the owner will be our data.owner, or if that doesn't exist, our currently logged in user. If we go back to our application now, we can go ahead and attempt to log in and see that it is working. When the page does load, however, we'll notice another deprecation warning, this time in reference to value link, which, if we look at our inventory component, is being used on the input fields to edit our fish name and our fish price so that it has the two-way binding between the inventory and the menu item. And this is out of the scope of this video and something that will be covered later on. But we are able to log a user successfully in and have them be able to edit stuff in the store. Of course, if we refresh, the app can't remember the state that the user, or whether or not a user was logged in. So we need a way to be able to remember or check if there is a user for a given state that we're on. And if we head back over to our Firebase guide and head up to the Manage Users in Web, we can see that we can get the currently signed in user with this firebase.auth.onStateChanged function, which takes a callback and will provide us the user. And where we want to put that method is in a React component lifecycle method called component will mount. And that is run just before the component is about to be mounted to the screen and rendered out. So we want to be able to say component will mount, and then pass in this Firebase data. And what we'd like to be able to do, if there is a user, is call this.auth handler and give it the user. The issue here with how we've copied it directly from Firebase, that Firebase guide, is that calling this inside of our callback function does not set this correctly. So use the ES6 version of arrow functions which implicitly bind this, so that we can keep track of what this is being our inventory component when we call auth handler. However, if we go back to our application now and let it refresh, we can see that we're getting an error saying cannot read property UID of undefined. And if we open up where it's causing that error, it's because it's saying that authData.user.uid does not exist. And this is because the way that the onAuthStateChanged function works is it passes the user explicitly, which the user, remember, was one of those properties on our auth data. So we need a way to be able to check for the auth data user or just the user itself. If we head back down to where we're using the auth data, we can go ahead and create a variable for the user that is set to either the authData.user, or if that doesn't exist, if we're just given the user object, just authData. And this will allow us to set everywhere that we're using authData.user to just be user now. And if we save this and go back to our application, still keeps us logged in. The last thing we want to be able to do is log a user out with the logout button. And if we head back over to our Firebase guide, we can go back to our GitHub guide and scroll to the bottom and see that there is a firebase.auth.signout method that we can call in order to sign users out. And if we create a signout method, we can go ahead and paste that in there. And if a user is signed out, or if this executes correctly, then we want to make sure that we have we update the state to reflect that by setting the UID to be null, and again changing to the ES6 standard of an arrow function so that we can keep this in context of our inventory. Then we want to be able to bind this to our logout method or our logout button. So we could say that on click is equal to this dot sign out. If we go back over to our application now, we should be able to click log out and be back at the login page.